Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade, and we're into the 30s. Oh, this is so cool, because number 31 has a nickname, and that nickname is the Hornsignal. We happen to know quite a bit about this symphony. Particularly, we actually know the date that it was composed, or at least the year, which was 1765. Haydn had only been a symphonist at this point for about 7 or 8 years. But my goodness, how far he'd come. This particular symphony is a big symphony. It lasts over 30 minutes in most performances, and the slow movement alone, if you take all the repeats, is longer than the first few symphonies. All of them. I don't mean all of them together. I mean each of the first few symphonies individually, the little 3-movement symphonies. It's a big, big, generous, giving, warm, jolly piece of music. Fantastic. And it's called the Hornsignal because it uses, well, it opens with a horn signal. Specifically, the post-horn signals, supposedly. You know, the post-horn was the mail. When the mail showed up, the guy gave his horn and he went like, "Wow, mail's here!" You know, and people would run out and, you know, welcome the stagecoach delivering the mail. So, you know, Haydn is having a very good time with his horns, and he's got 4 of them. A quartet of horns, which of course is standard stuff nowadays, but in Haydn's day it was unusual. And so he had this quartet of fabulous horns, and he wrote insanely virtuosic music for them to play. Now, this has produced some issues with future generations of commentators who really don't understand Haydn's attitude toward the symphony, which is very different from anybody else's, even though he invented it. Haydn's view of the symphony was, there was nothing like it really until Mahler. Remember Mahler's famous line that the symphony has to be the world, it must embrace everything? Yummy, like that, it embraces everything. Haydn's view of the symphony was like that. It wasn't pure, it was eclectic. It was a reflection of the universe as a whole. And it really was a remarkable vision for its time, and something that we really didn't appreciate until well over a century later. I mean, that's the truth of it. Mozart was as different a composer as possible from Haydn. Mozart was hermetically sealed. His entire universe was the expression of human emotion through vocal melody. That was Mozart. Haydn's symphonies have all kinds of stuff in them. You get storms, you get sunrises, you get bagpipes, you get the mail arriving, the horns and the stuff happening, and it's a reflection of life more generally, and that has been so misunderstood. And one of the things that Haydn had that Mozart and Beethoven, for example, did not, was his own orchestra. He had his own private orchestra that he could do anything he wanted with. He could experiment. He could write for the individual players. He included them in his personal repertoire of things that he could do symphonically. And for that reason, the Hornsignal Symphony has always been looked on slightly askance as not being like really symphonic, because the element of virtuosity, of extraordinary soloistic display, is so prominent in this symphony, and not just for the horns. Everybody gets something to do. You get flute solos, you get violin solos, you get cello solos, there's even a double bass solo. Everyone gets a chance to show off. The oboes do their thing. It's really a phenomenal piece of music, and that's part of Haydn's goal. But he doesn't, here's the point, he doesn't buy, you know, his virtuoso pyrotechnics, thank you, at the expense of symphonic construction. In fact, this symphony is absolutely fascinating formally and says some really, really, really important things about what the Haydn Symphony is and how it functions. And so I'm going to spend a little time really taking this one apart, because I want you to hear just how remarkable it is and how the exceptionally colorful orchestration and all of the wonderful solo opportunities that Haydn offers never detract from the symphonic flow of the work. It's just unbelievably cool what Haydn does here. So, as I said, this is a big symphony in 4 big movements. Now, the first thing we need to talk about is the first movement exposition. That is the presentation of the initial themes. The exposition, as some of you may know from my endless talks about sonata form and how composers handle it, consists of 2 thematic areas or 2 key areas. They're defined not by the melodies, but by the keys in which the melodies occur. So you have one key area, a subsidiary key area, then there's a whole development section that runs through a whole bunch of keys, and then a recapitulation that restates the original material, all in the home key. That's how those things work. But in this particular case, something very remarkable happens. It happens because of the uniqueness of the thematic material that Haydn chooses. Neither the first subject proper nor the second subject contain melodies. Melodies as we would understand them. That is, a tune you can hum or sing or say. That's not what they have. Their musical material is different, because Haydn, alone among composers of his day, understood the possibilities, the deeper possibilities of music as sound, as timbre, as melodic ideas that can be gestures or patterns or rhythms or anything but a singable tune. And that doesn't mean there aren't singable tunes here, but they're not where you expect. And that's what makes it so wonderful. So the first subject on the horns, the horns are, it's all about horns, this symphony. The horns begin with a fanfare, a sort of military fanfare, and that leads directly to the first subject, which is supposed to be the male arriving, or the post horn, or whatever the heck it is. The point is this: it's a one-note melody. It's just an octave. It just goes do da do do da do 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 da do do. That's all it is. You couldn't call it a tune because it only consists of one note. It's really amazing, kind of like totally fascinating. And then the whole orchestra comes in with all kinds of jumping around, and then it comes in with what I call the motion music. The purpose of the motion music is to get us from the home key to the next key, where we'll hear the second bunch of thematic ideas. Now, the motion music, it's a lot of rhythm and scales and things, but not usually very interesting tunes. Well, in this particular symphony, the motion music contains the tune. That's where you hear actual thematic material. So the motion music contains a very beautiful melody. It's lyrical and lovely. And that gets us to the second subject, which is also a non-tune. All it is a upward rising scale on the solo flute. In this case, it just goes. That's all it is. I mean, it's not a melody. And then after the second subject, you get a whole series of closing ideas that bring the exposition to a close, which is more motion music, which contain more melodies. So the whole thematic substance of this exposition is not allocated in the way we normally expect. And that is what makes it so marvelous. What does this do? What it does is that it focuses your attention on the sound of those solo instruments. I mean, it's just timbre. It's the sound of the solo. It's a flute scale. It's a horn octave. It couldn't be more basic or elemental. And so that means what Haydn has to do in the development is going to be even more fascinating, because how do you develop melodies that have no melody? And he does it. And that I'm going to leave to you to figure out when we run the whole movement. But first, I want you to hear just the exposition, just that bit, because I think it's really, really important. And I'm going to indicate where all the little bits are. The first subject, the motion music, the second subject. So he'll hear exactly what I'm talking about. It's fascinating, fascinating music. And, you know, commentators and people, they don't get into this, and I don't understand why. They just say, oh, well, it's very virtuosic, and so you don't really hear the symphonic element like you do in some other Haydn symphonies where he's dealing with more thematic material. It's nonsense. Absolutely nonsense. This one has a completely unique form that suits the musical content of the piece. I mean, it just doesn't get more basic than that. But Haydn, you see, he always understood these fundamental points, always, like no other composer in history, really. And so his music is uniquely formed around the basic concept of each of his symphonies. So let's listen to the exposition with this. It's the Nicholas Esterhazy Sinfonia with Bela Drahos on Naxos, and you'll hear exactly what I'm talking about. Here you go. I mean, isn't that fun? It's just cool stuff. But Haydn's presenting his characters, the characters that inhabit these key areas, the horns and the flute, and everybody else is sort of remarking on them. It's just marvelous. Now, there's something else I do want to talk about with respect to the sound of this particular symphony, and that is the quartet of horns. The quartet of horns is a bit of an issue in modern performances because, you know, on period instruments, if you have a quartet of natural horns, my God, they make a racket. They make an unbelievable, god-awful racket. I mean, horns in Haydn's day, you have to think about this. They were loud, first of all, because they played outdoors. They played hunting calls, and they played the mail was arriving from afar. I mean, these people were not known for their subtlety. They just blasted away. And they were natural horns, which means they could only play certain notes, and some of them weren't in tune. And in order to get other notes, you had to stuff your hand in the bell, or you had to change the piping with little things called crooks that you would change the length of the horn so you could change the key that it played in. I mean, it was a project. It was a real project. And even today, when people play on period instruments, you know, they're playing modern instruments. They're playing modern replicas of period instruments so that, you know, you have modern mouthpieces and scientifically designed and bored and accurate length of tubing coiled properly for the horn. I mean, there's no way we can recapture the hellish din that Haydn's horn section must have made. But yet, we know that the people played this music. He wrote extraordinarily difficult parts for them, and they played them. They played them. Somehow they played them. And they played them in an orchestra that probably numbered only around 20 people in front of an audience that probably consisted of half a dozen people or less in a relatively small room. So this symphony was loud. It was really loud and kind of raucous. It must have been. I don't know how they did it, But, you know, today you'll never hear it played the way it would have been in Haydn's day, even with period instruments. And some of them make a remarkably raw sound. I want to just play you the opening. I have here a performance with Thomas Fye, which is very good, with the Heidelberger Symphoniker, which is a period instrument style performance. And you'll hear how different the horns sound. I mean, he shapes them with dynamics and conducting and all the kind of stuff that never would have happened in Haydn's day. In Haydn's day, he would have just gone boom with his, I mean, Haydn probably played the violin in this. And there's no evidence that he played harpsichord continuo, which is, of course, in the performance we just heard, which annoys me. And it would have just been just a totally raucous event. I don't know how people sat through it, but they did. So listen to the opening on a more natural horn-sounding ensemble, such as we hear in this excellent Hensler classic recording with Thomas Fye. Here you go. I mean, it's really quite different. You have to be careful, I think, with these period instrument performances, because some of them really think that no matter, you know, the more crude and ugly and loud and brassy they make it sound, the more authentic it is. That may be true, but that's also the reason that they invented valves and improved the horn, because no one could tolerate the appalling noise that the thing made in a small enclosed concert space. So I just want to throw that out there. Now, there's something else I want to explain to you about how the first movement operates. It really is one of the most marvelous moments occurs at the recapitulation, that is at the end of the development and the beginning of the return of the principal ideas. Now, you know, the principal idea, you've just heard it, is a fanfare. Dum, ba-da-dum, ba-bum, ba-da-dum, ba-bum, ba-da-dum, ba-bum, ba-dum. That's the opening of the symphony. So that's what's supposed to come back. In fact, this is what Haydn writes and what we expect to hear. I've done a little fabulous editing so you get a sense of what a boring formulaic composer would have done. This is what we expect. I'm playing now the end of the development and the beginning of the recapitulation. So listen to this. But that's not what we hear. That isn't what Haydn does. Let me play you now what Haydn does. Oh my, isn't that a little different? The fanfare's missing. It's gone. And he substitutes a marvelously moody, brooding minor key surprise. And then after that, slowly fades away. He just begins with the post-horn theme, the octave theme in the horns, quietly. It's a complete shocker. And, you know, Haydn is very smart because he wants to end the movement with the fanfare, and so he saves it. He saves it for the very end. And that's one of the things that makes the piece so symphonic. You know, for those of you who think that because it has lots of virtuosic solo writing for the instruments, that Haydn somehow, you know, dumbed it down. That's just so untrue, and it's such a shallow way to think about music. And to second guess a genius, which is never a good idea. It really isn't. So now let's run the whole first movement. I want you to hear the whole thing without repeats, of course, but just all the way through in with everything in its proper place, and you'll hear just what a bloody genius Haydn was. Here you go. Splendid thing, isn't it? It's absolutely magnificent, just full of high spirits with that one minor key shadow. And remember that one minor key shadow. Just remember it. It's gonna matter, because Haydn doesn't do anything without thinking about the long-term consequences of what he's doing. We should have learned that by now, right? We've had 30 examples of it. Now we're on 31. Okay, now the second movement continues the joy of solo writing. It's a Siciliano, or Siciliano, if you want to just say it in English. That's a lovely, lovely tune in 6/8 time, usually some sort of compound meter in the rhythm. Dum, bum, 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 ba-dum, ba, da-da, da, da, something like that. You know, usually for pastoral melodies. And it also features the quartet of horns, alternating with solo violin and solo cello. When the solo violin and solo cello play, the strings accompany with delicious little pizzicati, which in this performance, unfortunately, get drowned out by the harpsichord a little bit. And then when the horns play, the strings play normally, arco, with their bows. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful movement. I'm going to play you the exposition because it's in normal slow movement sonata form, which we've discussed in many of these other videos. So watch those other videos because the knowledge we gain is cumulative, and you'll get a sense of it. But it really is. It's just a touching and charming movement, and full of sweetness and light. And the horn writing, of course, is just beautiful, very romantic. It's just lovely, lovely stuff. Here you go. So you can listen to the rest of the movement yourself, obviously, and hear how it goes. It has some fabulous, fabulous changes of key and harmonic things in the development / recapitulation. And the movement is long. It's about 10 minutes long, as I said, which is as long as the entire first or second symphonies. So it's a big, big symphony that gives people lots of time to enjoy the wonderful instrumental colors that Haydn is displaying for us. Now the third movement is the minuet, and I'm going to play it somewhat out of order because I've done this before. I want you to hear the middle section, the trio, and then that leads back to the minuet without repeats. So rather than me having to make myself crazy editing everything, we're going to play the trio without repeats. I don't know if I do it with her. I don't know. I don't remember how I edited it. And then the entire minuet, so you can hear it. And like everything else in this symphony, it has a wonderful feature of solo woodwinds and not strings in this particular minuet, but just lots and lots of instrumental color. And you see, Haydn, always, I say, he always thought of his pieces whole. We've heard in previous talks all kinds of ways that he binds symphonies together using rhythmic figures and melodic figures and motives and all kinds of things. But in this particular symphony, all he has to do is keep doing what he's doing. Emphasize the horns, the sound of the horns, which characterizes all four movements, and the other solo instruments as they come and go. That's the principle. And that's how you know that this is a single symphony united by an overarching aesthetic concept. And that's why it's so stupid to criticize the fact that it has instrumental virtuosity. It might be if it like had no purpose, but it does. It serves a genuine formal purpose, aside from just being enchanting and fabulous and wonderful to listen to all by itself. So here is the trio and then complete minuet, where you'll hear much wonderful writing for the woodwind section. So, here we come now to the finale. Now, the finale is a new thing in Haydn symphonies. It is a theme and variations. Haydn would write zillions of variation movements, but this is the first major variation set in any of these symphonies that we have heard. Of course, the idea of a variation, that is taking a tune and changing it in some way, is the bedrock principle of symphonic writing. I mean, and of musical form. You can reduce all of musical form to two ideas: repetition and variation. If you have repetition and variation, you have form. That's what form is, essentially. And the type of form that you're working with all has to do with how you organize the various repetitions and variations into different patterns. But a variation movement is a very special thing. You take a melody, and then you have discrete variations that happen one after the other. And as you might have guessed, in that kind of form, it's chunky. It comes in chunks. It's not continuously fluid, the way the first movement of the symphony was, or even the slow movement. It is episodic. And because it's episodic, you lose something of the continuity that you usually enjoy in symphonic finales. Haydn has a way of dealing with that, you will see. But that's basically what's going to happen in each of these variations. It summarizes the whole content of the symphony, because each variation highlights a different solo instrument or group of instruments. There are seven variations in all. And the way that it shakes out, I'm going to play it for you. I'm going to present to you the whole theme, which is played by the strings. Now, the theme itself comes in two sections, each of which gets repeated. So the form of the theme is A, A, B, B. You get two sections, both repeated in two halves. And the reason for that is because if you have solo instruments playing, they can ornament the repeats, which sometimes in modern performances, sometimes they'll do it and sometimes they don't. I mean, never hurts to hear something twice. It also allows you to get a sense of what the variation sounds like in relation to the original theme, because you get to hear it twice. And hearing everything twice tells you where you are in the theme. That is the first half versus the second half. It's very helpful as a guidepost to how the variations are going. So I'm going to play you the entire theme, and then only the first half of all the variations, separated by 1.5 second pauses. So you can hear the beginning of each variation just to get a sense of where it's going. And then I can turn you loose and you can listen to your own. Listen to the whole thing on your own, that is. But the variations have the following order of events. All right, so first you have the entire theme in the strings. Then you have a variation that features the oboes, because they haven't had much to do leading things yet, so it features the oboes with some horns behind them and strings accompanying, but basically it's for the oboes. Then you get solo cello. Then you get the solo flute. Then you get the horn section, the whole horn section, all four of them, a glorious variation for all of the horns. And then you get the solo violin. I think I'm doing this in the right order. If I'm not, this is what happens somewhere. You'll notice it. Now you get the solo violin, and then, the solo violin, and then you get one for the whole orchestra. The whole ensemble gets a chance to come in and, sort of jazz things up a bit. And then you get the solo double bass, which sounds quite special. He was always into giving his double bass players something to do when he could, which is rather fascinating. And again, part of the idea that the principle of solo virtuosity never deserts Haydn in any of these symphonies. It's not exploited to the extreme that it is in this symphony all the time, but it's always present and always something that he can turn to create color and variety in his symphonic writing. So you get the solo double bass, and then after the solo double bass, something else happens, and we're going to consider that separately. So now let's listen to the theme plus the beginning of the 7 variations in the finale, so you get a sense of how that all is going to shake out. Here you go. Now, naturally, it's more continuous than what you just heard because I was cutting them up and putting pauses between them. It all flows together rather nicely, so you don't have to worry about that. But then when you get done with the 7 variations, there is a coda. Now, do you remember the minor key surprise in the first movement? Yes, I'm sure you do. Well, the coda begins with another minor key surprise. And Haydn has saved his minor key surprises for these moments for a very good reason, because most of this symphony is incredibly cheerful and has had very few excursions into sadder or possibly more tragic emotions. And Haydn is never one to pass up the opportunity to create a healthy bit of contrast at the right time. And he did it in the first movement, just before the recapitulation, and he does it here to remind us of what we heard in the first movement, number 1, and number 2, to just cast a sudden shadow, a cloud, over the whole proceedings before the sun bursts out and the tempo increases to presto, and we have a dazzling coda. And this coda, it was called in the day, I think it was called something like a Kehraus. There was some word for it in Austrian parlance. It means a go home. A clear out the dance hall, wrap it all up and let everybody go. And that's what this is. And there are other pieces by classical composers that do exactly the same thing. A series of variations and then a very quick wrap up. One of the most famous is Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 17, which has a marvelous example of just what Haydn does here. Came later, of course. But this particular example, after that dark, sort of shocking minor key excursion, it takes off like a shot. And best of all, Haydn reserves the final surprise for the very end. It's the return of the opening horn call, which is just, I mean, you may not think that's a big deal, but it really is. It is, because this is one of the first symphonies that has actual, what we call cyclical form. That is, the movement actually recalls a theme from a previous movement. That doesn't happen very often in classical symphonies, but Haydn does it here. And it's another example of how, even in this circumstance, even in this very unconventional symphony with all these solos going off and all of this terribly distracting stuff, he actually insists on the symphonic principle, the idea of organic unity between all 4 parts of this symphony. And that is just such a marvelous thing. There are no zero-sum games in Haydn, ever. He never sacrifices one quality to emphasize another. He always has his cake and eats it too. So let me play you now the coda, beginning with that dark minor key little episode and the final presto wind-up. Here we go. Brilliant, genius, fabulous, great piece. An amazing piece of symphonic writing that does everything a symphony is supposed to do and does it on the grandest possible scale while giving every single element of Haydn's fantastic orchestra an opportunity to strut its stuff and show Prince Nicholas Esterházy that he was very smart to hire these musicians and continue to pay them to entertain himself and his family. It's just a wonderful, wonderful work, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed talking about it. I could talk about this symphony for hours. It's such a miracle of music and such a milestone in the history of symphonic writing, of a particular kind of symphonic writing, a kind that I think the potential of which would not be realized to the same degree until way, way later. That's just how special Haydn was. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.